perfect churn record, which in like B2B SaaS, that is something to pay attention to. Just the way companies embrace the value proposition of continuous listening correlated to business outcome metrics was clear that there's like a huge untapped opportunity there. There's something really big here. Why not charge full steam ahead? We had a very smart, very intelligent board that was also like, yep, that's exactly right. You should do that.
It's very fascinating that they decided to focus on retain while that meant a major cut in the revenue.
We started looking at the business as like a $1 million business. If you think of it as like, okay, you've got this 10 million thing, this 1 million thing, this 1 million thing is growing really fast. But if you sum those together, you go from like 11 million to 12 million to 13 million. It's like a really sad growth rate.
Thank you so much for joining this episode of the podcast, Tommy. I'm just a little bit curious about like your career story. So you started your career as a software engineer before moving into product. Can you a little bit like explain what happened? How did you decide to become a product manager?
Well, it's pretty simple because I'm old, and when I was a younger person, like I started out engineering in like the late 90s, and there was no such thing as product management back then. Um, I didn't even like know about the thing. Like I worked a lot at Nokia around the time of the Agile Manifesto, and I learned about Scrum, and I learned about the role of the product owner at that point, and I got really indoctrinated in like the procedural aspects of Scrum. But at that time, especially in Europe where I was, there was no such thing as product management. Then I moved to New York City in 2012, and I was like the CTO slash first employee of a small startup. And we raised a seed round, we raised a Series A, and we started scaling the team. And somebody asked me, well, why aren't you hiring a product manager? And my first question was like, what the hell is a product manager? I knew about product owners, but product managers were not on my radar. And I started doing research, and I realized that this is something Silicon Valley is already doing like really aggressively. New York had just started realizing that this thing exists. And I started Googling job descriptions, and I realized that this is everything that I wanted. Like, this is what I want to do with my career. So my mindset changed immediately to I am in product now. But then it took me a couple of years to navigate the transition because back then product jobs were still pretty scarce. Um, and if you had I had almost 15 years of engineering experience, so it's like hard to justify why I'm not going for engineering roles, because back then the supply and demand were really warped. So if you were an engineer, you were being pulled into jobs right away. So me trying to justify that, hey, you should hire me for something I've never done, took a while. And I had to kind of do a couple of transitional jobs where I was like, hey, like going to smaller companies and being like, hey, you're trying to hire like a lead developer or whatever. I think you also need a product person. Can I be both? And then we'll carve out the title to be more product centric so that it fits my career transition. And then 2015 onwards, it's been nothing but product, basically.
So that's very fascinating. I think maybe you can shine some more light on this, but I think the whole emerge of product management became popular when we started to have more digital products, which they constantly needed to be updated or developed, and like kind of the technology started to have a faster expansion. How but on the other scenario, like if we look at some like back in the 90s, usually they used to create the software and then they would just push it out there and then they would sell it. So I think there were not much out there like as a SaaS product, like how we have it today.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like right on the money in that the journey from like servers to cloud, or like on-prem to cloud, and then the business model transformation from like purchasing licenses to subscriptions had a huge impact in how you build software products. And in that transform, I mean, you could argue that software products always needed product management. You always needed somebody to figure out what customer value or what customer opportunities and problems there are. How can we solve them and create customer value, and how can we capture that as business value, and blah 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 blah. That's always existed, but in the past model where it was kind of like one and done, like you said, you built the software, you put it on a DVD or a CD-ROM or whatever, or you shipped it to like a somebody to install on a server somewhere in like a company's boiler room. Uh, it's worked a little better to have like the leadership team and the business analysts and kind of, and then engineering managers manage the what gets built and when and where. But then as we got to this kind of SaaS and cloud as a paradigm where the cost to change software went almost to zero, and you could really iterate rapidly, you could ship all the time, even before like the DevOps revolution, the need for somebody to have an ongoing view on what's being done became much more critical. And we also learned a lot more about like value flow and how software is unique in how you create constant value flow through the system. And then we of course had to also go through like a bad period where before product management existed, nobody really connected the dots between kind of the implementation, the business value, and the customer value. So I think right around the time when I found my way into product was almost like this time when a lot of people thought that like the engineering leaders should be just deciding the backlog in like this weird agency customer relationship with like the business, and it just created all these like unhealthy handovers. And frankly, like the engineering leaders hated it, the business people hated it. So we were created as almost like this effigy in the middle. So yeah, it was like a lot of different forces coming into one.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how has your experience been, but I always find it difficult to enter a company who they never had a product manager, and kind of the founder or the co-founder or the product leaders, and then you jump in and you want to ask and you want to get permission to do a lot of these product decisions which they used to do, and it's you always have a battle with them that they want to kind of like keep the whole ownership, but then you're hired there to like kind of help them with either it's like a product market fit or it's just in the growth stage. I also find that sometimes companies reach to like 30, 40, 50 hit counts, and yet they have actually no product leader to that point. That could be product owner or product manager. So I was curious, did you had some similar experience in that, or how did you even tackle this kind of situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that specific scenario and problem set is a really critical part of a product person's journey into maturity. I've gone through the really frustrating, like, why doesn't the founder understand me? Or even in a slightly larger company, like, why don't the COO or CRO or CFO, like, why don't they understand me? And why don't they get how product is done? And I think the really critical thing is, I actually these days I love the scenario that you're describing, where like a company's gotten somewhere with no formal product management and no formal like product thinking. And I kind of love coming into that because even though you're right, it's really difficult to transform those companies into like thoughtful, deliberate, strategic. Um, Being the first to actually introduce those things makes you kind of a miracle worker. Uh, and the trick really is that like you have to have incredibly deep empathy, like the same level of empathy you'd have for customers, you have to have for the founders, the other leaders, because nobody's acting out of malice or stupidity. It's more like the stuff that we as a craft bring to the table, at least in my very humble yet hot take opinion, are not necessarily in the early days. I've actually never really seen a company quote unquote do product super well in the early days and succeed. And I think that a huge part of that is our industry and our craft. It's a lot about like validation, de-risking, and essentially like increasing batting average, which is an essential characteristic later on. as the organization grows, the customer base grows, the product footprint grows, and because of that, the cost of mistakes starts rising exponentially. So you kind of want to de-risk things. You want to make sure you formally research and validate assumptions and do experiments. But in the early days, those are inertia. Those slow you down. And in the early days, times at bat, how many times can you take a swing at the ball is the only thing that matters. And unfortunately, a lot of like what we as a product industry consider to be high quality product management and high quality product work are actually things that slow the process down. And I think the reason why I mentioned the empathy part is kind of understanding what's created the success thus far and what the company really needs to reach its goals right now, rather than looking at it through like a functional lens of I need to establish this process, this framework, this thing, that thing, and start thinking of all the things we do as a toolkit. And then ask yourself, like, what the company here today needs the most, like, what tools are the best suited for that? And start thinking of it more as like a long term transition than kind of a hey, founder, I'm here now to establish proper product management. And so we're going to do all this discovery work. We're going to do all these experiments. We're going to second guess all of our instincts. And that's especially for founders who found success through like hustle and grind and just taking instinct driven swings at things. They look at it, they're like, oh, so things that took us 2 days in the past are now like 2 weeks or 2 months or two whatever. That seems dumb. And that's kind of how we often get ourselves into trouble, is failing to articulate the reasons of the things we put in place through the lens of like what is the company trying to achieve, whether it's like you know, trying to exit the early investors at a certain point, or raise a decent series whatever next year, or you know, what is like the real actual goal that's driving decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what would be the issue a lot of the product managers also faces kind of not understanding the requirement of the company, as you just mentioned so well. It's like sometimes product manager worked at a company which they were more focusing on optimizing and also in expansion, and then you just enter a new company which is as I said, you're kind of the first product managers. So your expectation and what they expect are also not matching. So that's why a lot of the times so many product managers are just confused when they enter a new company, because what they had in their mind as their job role is not the same as the requirement of that job role over there.
That's exactly right. And I always get nervous whenever product people start approaching product roles as like one size fits all. It's every job is a like context sensitive job to some degree. I would argue that product is one of the most context sensitive roles, where the longer I'm in product, the less I have these like, well, every place you do X, Y, and Z. It's no like I find another environment and then suddenly X doesn't work anymore. And like, for example, my most recent job, for the first time I was leading a product organization building product for biggest possible enterprise companies. And I had to really rewire a lot of the ways I thought about what excellence looks like in product, simply because the context of building somewhat critical software for enterprise companies simply can't behave the same way as building something for like highly change tolerant and kind of fast converting consumer or solopreneur customers. So it's kind of, the older I get, the more I start thinking of everything I do and everything we do, like every book I've read, as just a toolbox where there's a lot of tools I never touch. That doesn't make them less valuable. It's just they're there in my toolbox waiting for the right context. And then there's some tools that I use always, but I know that there's a total possibility that I find myself in a context where this tool just isn't useful right now. So And the thing you mentioned, like understanding the company context and kind of trying to shed your functional lens, like kind of your product lens on like what should good look like, that's a really critical transition from like a mid-level product person to a senior product person, because one thing that we pretty characteristically get wrong is time frame. Product people love long time frames. We love kind of peacetime mode where we think in terms of like long-term cumulative gains and kind of this, just we always play the long game, whereas like especially the types of companies I work for, which usually are like early scale up stage companies, timeframes are like measured in quarters. Like usually you've got some sort of event, whether it's a fundraise or whatever, that's happening within the next couple of quarters. And you just don't have the luxury to like lean too heavily on research and experimentation. You just, for better and worse, you just have to take slightly riskier, more instinct driven bets and just kind of bias for action for better or worse.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked about scaling up the companies. By that, I think that means like scaling up the product of the company. So I'm just curious, how did your engineering background help in scaling up the products, or did it help?
Well, I mean, funny you should say that, because I actually think scaling up companies and scaling up products, like it's a dangerous connection to make, because that's usually what I, when I join companies, usually kind of after product market fit, I find them in this like aggressively expansive mode. Like when in doubt, add more product, or when in doubt, add more go to market channels. When in doubt, add more geos or verticals or industries, or basically expand your footprint, expand your ICP. And I've almost, again, like I said, nothing is always exactly the same, but a fairly reasonable first hypothesis that I've found to be true is this like business growth through product reduction almost. And I've found myself gravitating to the thought of like, how could we create more growth for this business by reduction? And my engineering background plays a huge part in it, because as an engineer, both in terms of your kind of systems thinking, quant mindset, and in terms of just like interacting with code bases, you start forming a really crisp understanding of what's in mathematics called combinatorial explosion, which literally just means that as you add dimensions to a thing, how fast the combinations explode to a huge number. So, like, if you imagine kind of an early product where it's like kind of one core feature, one core ICP, one target geographic, it's super simple. Everybody's just like doing the same thing. But you start adding like second product, second, go to market strategy, separate or second geo. It's not four things. It's, it's exponential. And so as an engineer, I really learned to embrace the fact that if you need to move fast and if you need to create a lot of value with high efficiency, galvanization and alignment are essential. And oftentimes you kind of mentioned the 50, 60, 70, or like even earlier headcount. When you're a company that's created a lot of value with like 20 people, and then you kind of, it takes off and you maybe raise another round and you hire 50, 60, 90, 100 people, you think you can do all these things, but your capability to add new things doesn't grow like in a linear function with your headcount. It's so anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying like I think that's my core engineering background thing that's helped me is really embrace trying to find the key thing that's working in the business, and then trying to like shed at least like side like put back on the back burner things that aren't working, or sunset them, or delay them and just say like the time is not right for this yet. And that's been the number one influence. The other thing is for better and worse, understanding or having empathy for engineers, because I've never yet met an engineering team that's like, oh no, we don't need to rebuild, this is fine, like our code base is great. I know as an engineer, you're always filled with this burning desire to like burn everything down and rebuild it. And that's fine, right? Like that's just the engineering craftsperson desire coming in. And what you as a product leader need to do is help the engineering team and the engineering leaders really separate like genuine burning business needs to de-risk like performance meltdowns and reduce customer pain points from poor performance from the ugh, I don't want to work on somebody else's code stuff, and then really navigate the we need to rebuild everything conversation gracefully.
Yeah, absolutely. I was reading your blog post, the one that you sent me on LinkedIn. And one of them I just really liked. I just want to really talk about it. So you have written about the friction that can arise between the go-to-market teams and the R&D teams in the early stage of scale-ups. So how have you managed to align these two sides of the business when their priorities start to diverge?
Yeah, it's really hard, first of all. And a lot of the things, whenever I talk to frustrated product people, they're always like, oh, sales is coming to me with all these like crazy ideas. And I'm just building the features that like customer success is telling me customers need. And it's just that nobody cares. A lot of these problems, whenever I'm asked, like, well, how would you solve this problem? That's almost like treating the symptom of a disease rather than the disease itself. The disease usually is a lack of alignment on ICP, like just answering the question of who is our customer and how narrow can we take that while still having enough headroom to grow. I found that most leadership teams just haven't gone through a really brutally honest exercise of like, let's narrow our aperture to as tight as we can. Because if that isn't done, almost always like sales is selling to some demographic or some segment, marketing is marketing, and product is building product, and operations is supporting and delivering services for whatever segment that makes sense for their functional metrics. Like I've seen it a million times when like marketing is marketing to whoever it's easiest for them to bring into the funnel. You know what I mean? But that does not necessarily mean that that segment that is the easiest for marketing to like get their numbers right, that the rest of the funnel is aligned with that. And so the first thing that I almost always do is really ensure that I'm working as a leader, as an executive with my fellow executives to get on the same page of like, number one, why we need to have a brutally tight ICP definition. Uh, One where we still believe as a leadership team that there's enough addressable market to be captured. So we're not like tightening our market so tight that there's no room to grow. And then really aligning on like what does the whole funnel look like? What are the value propositions that we need to put in front of customers as they're still prospects? And what do we need to have in order to create and deliver value for them and retain them? So effectively kind of your go-to-market strategy and your product strategy in one. Because if there's any air between those, downstream product managers are going to be chasing their tail, just trying to satisfy sales needs. Salespeople are going to be super frustrated because they have a what's in their bag just isn't converting. Marketing's putting all the wrong signals out there. And it's funny because oftentimes the pain can be really delayed because if somebody converts with kind of a false assumption of what your product does, that might be set at the very first touch point, there'll be a really vocally dissatisfied customer. And that also creates a lot of friction for product teams because if you just look at kind of your customer feedback through the lens of like how many people have cried about the missing button on the front page, you're still not necessarily like answering the question of like, are these angry people the people we should be serving in the first place? Or are these angry people just there because we were successful in the funnel getting them in there? And now we're stuck in this death spiral of trying to make our angriest customers happy when we have silent, happy customers that we just are failing to acquire. And the last piece for product people especially, even if all these things are in place and the strategy and the ICP definition, everything is like humming, I found it remarkably rare for product people to understand the world of especially sales, marketing, operations, and whatnot as well. But sales as like the kind of profession where you eat what you kill, I still find really a lot of product people and engineers and designers who don't understand that their colleagues behind the wall are compensated on their performance, like directly. If they don't hit their quota, they probably don't make a lot of money, and vice versa. If they hit their quota, they're making a good amount of money. So every single thing they do, every interaction that they have is through the lens of, can I get my bills paid, or like, can I, order the Lambo, uh, like through that lens. And if you as a colleague and a partner don't understand that, like, you get your paycheck and you vest your equity no matter what, but these other people are heavily dependent on this quarter's performance, you're going to have really terse interactions where, like, there's no way to like build a bridge between those.
I just really like what you just talked about the salespeople, and I think that's something which kind of always makes me proud because I think we as a product people we are working with so many departments, and we have the decision to like prioritize something and also affect someone's work. That could be an engineer, that could be a salesperson. If we prioritize something which will, for example, increase the revenue, then that salesperson can maybe take more money home and get that Lambo, right? But
Yep.
at the same time, maybe we decide something, maybe something in the marketing side, it doesn't have priority for us. And we just either we kill it or we just never implement it. So I really think you as a product manager, a product leader, what you should really focus on is actually going out there and learning all these skills, like learning all these departments. Like, and we talked about engineering. Like, engineering is such a critical part of the product management work. And despite that, many product managers really have zero understanding of the engineering background they have. I focus mostly on mobile. So they have no understanding of how the mobile life cycle works, what is backend infrastructure, why certain thing takes longer time. And I think when you kind of show to those people you have understanding or you're willing to understand that thing, it kind of puts more empathy and trust toward your decision. They follow you as a leader, not as a boss, just ordering people around.
You just used the exact most important keyword there, which is trust. It's product management and product in general is such a game of diplomacy, if you will. And diplomacy is always like, trust is the number one currency that you're trading on. And a lot of people don't understand. I like Reid Hoffman's definition of trust as consistency over time, which is, can people learn to like trust your actions, trust your um, that your intentions are to the best interest of the whole company, uh, and that you're not playing favorites, you're not playing kind of the negative side of politics. And it takes a long time to build. Somebody has used this analogy of like the trust battery, that you have to keep recharging if you're using it. And you also need to remember that in almost all scenarios, your trust batteries start at zero. So many people come to new jobs assuming that, okay, they hired me as a hotshot product person. Trust battery is 100%. I can just start like trading on that trust. And what you don't realize is that you're starting from zero, and there's going to be interactions that require that trust battery. And if you haven't taken the time to charge it, you're going to have a hard time, and you don't even necessarily realize it, that you're kind of trading on trust you don't have, and then you're creating enemies, or at least friction. And so it is really critical, and it's kind of the one of the hardest parts of product is, like you just said, you have to kind of learn a million different things. You like, I came into product through engineering. My biggest failures in my first couple of years in product was leaning too heavy on that engineering background and thinking that I can be a successful product manager and product leader simply by kind of camping out with the engineers and making friends there. And then I started realizing that I won't be able to make progress if I don't learn to speak in the language of all these other constituencies, show empathy, really listen, make prioritization rulings that are not consistently against their interests. And that way, even those situations where you have to tell sales, like, look, you're not going to make your Christmas bonus this year, we're not delivering this thing that you're starving for. If the trust battery is full and they understand that you're making that decision so that the following quarter's bonuses are going to be overwhelmingly huge, they'll happily say, like, look, that's fine, my kids will get, rocks this Christmas, um, and everything will be fine. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So we talked about a couple of times about the scaling up a product. So what are the most critical hires that you had to scale up a product?
Critical hire, I mean, like, as in roles in the product org.
Mm, yes, and maybe no. Like, let's say that could be maybe a revenue officer, another designer. What type of designer, or like what do you think could had helped you a lot in terms of like scaling up? What is it
Yeah,
there maybe other product managers or founders are like missing out?
yeah, it's I'm gonna jam on that question for a second. The only reason I find myself a little finding myself in a sticky spot, because this is one of those things where context matters so much, and it basically hinges on, like, what's holding this product back right now the most. As an example, in my previous role at WorkStep, um, I genuinely believe we had a product. I mean, we had a mile long roadmap of things we knew would create value. And of course, as a product person, I wanted to be like, I want to hire 100 million engineers and all the designers and product managers I can find and staff up a product operations team and whatever. But as an executive, I knew that the biggest thing holding that product back was our ability to kind of generate awareness of the product and really pound the pavement, bringing in new customers. Because I knew when customers landed into the product, they were incredibly happy and it demonstrably created value, and they retained, they expanded. So I found it really hard to make the case that, hey, we need to bring in a ton more builders, because the biggest bottleneck was just the kind of top of funnel and the go to market. And so in that case, as an executive, I'm going to vouch for bringing in really seasoned sales leadership, really like killer account managers and account executives. But if the situation was different, if I was at a company where like the value prop was resonating like crazy, but then all the customers were coming into the product and they were like, what the heck is this nonsense? I'd be like, okay, yo, we need extremely smart, talented product managers. Or like if we had a product that was like a great product, but it was down all the time, or, response times were garbage, or the whole architecture was just like collapsing because it was such a mess, I'd be like, yo, we need an engineering leader. We need like real senior engineers here. Um, so I don't have like a silver bullet. It all depends on kind of like what's the biggest, like weakest link in the chain. I am a strong advocate after a certain point. I don't want to say like a magic number, but let's say like 100 people. When like the R&D organization is like 6 to 10 pods strong. So doing the math, that's like 50 plus people. I think product operations is such a critical function that we're right now only realizing the importance of, because all the stuff around like running a scaling product organization, all the overhead work, all the work that doesn't really fit into any role, like running a research operation, a research CRM, running demo sessions, making sure our like new employee onboarding materials are incredibly strong, making sure that our like connective tissue with other departments are great, all the rituals and whatever is run in an efficient way. That stuff starts bearing so much fruit after a certain amount of time that if you neglect building even a small product operations unit, if you delay it too late, you're going to pay a hefty price for it. But if you build that muscle at the right time, it can really unlock a product organization and kind of remove a lot of the confusion and friction that otherwise happens if you just like staff these independent pods with like no real enablement to them.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was reading your blog post, you had a lot of conversation around the work steps to product journey. So can you a little bit explain what was it about? What were the products about? And then we can ask more questions in depth about that.
Yeah, I'll try and keep this short. It's I'm still struggling to really condense the story because there's so much nuance. But basically, when I joined WorkStep, it was a two product company. It had its core product that was kind of the original product that had built the house, which was a very clever little like add-on to the talent acquisition pipeline for large companies with frontlines, like huge frontline staff footprints. So think of companies with like tens of thousands of trucks on the roads and hundreds of distribution centers and storage facilities. So if you need people to drive those trucks and man the forklifts and move the boxes, you need a lot of frontline people. And that industry is kind of quirky with like incredibly high turnover rates and a lot of usage of fairly toxic patterns like temp agencies and so forth. So WorkStep had built a product that was a little like a almost like a dating app on top of the standard. Like if you're a kind of frontline worker, you go to Craigslist or Indeed or ZipRecruiter and you find like a warehouse job in your area. But those are very low retaining positions, so you kind of end up just getting a job, doing it for a couple of weeks, and then quitting. And so WorkStep's original hypothesis was that if you add a little bit more on top of it, a little bit of like questions answered by both parties, and then a little bit of like matchmaking data sciencey stuff, you could create a much more high retention relationship. So I'm doing exactly what I said I wouldn't do, which is I'm going through the whole long version of the story. When I joined, they had that product and they had just kind of, oh, good question. WorkStep Hire. Very pragmatic name. You use that product to hire people. They had also spun out a product called WorkStep Retain because WorkStep Hire's business model was you didn't pay per like impression, you didn't pay per like eyeball or conversion, you didn't even pay by hired person. You paid for retention success, meaning if the worker got to day 60 or 30 or 90 or whatever, then you would pay WorkStep, which meant that WorkStep had skin in the game to create retention. And so what they had done is that they had kind of created almost accidentally this like continuous listening tool. So they'd send check-ins, like simple SMSs on, day 7, day 30, day 60, day 90 to check in on the employee. How are you doing? How are you gelling with the team? How's your manager? Like basic things. And then customers were looking at it and they were like, wait a minute. Can I just use that for my entire workforce and not just like the couple of people we've hired through WorkStep? And of course, WorkStep was like, yes, you can. And that became WorkStep Retain. And as I joined, we're at a point where like WorkStep Retain was this like little footnote in terms of revenue. It was like 500,000 ARR maybe, with like just a handful of customers driving most of that. And WorkStep Hire was a relatively meaningful $10 million a year revenue stream. But as I spent my first like 3 months analyzing the business, I realized that like the real scalability upside of WorkStep Hire was almost impossible. Like there was so many like hard assumptions about being able to change job seeker behavior, where like the scale it would have required was so incredibly big that was like an absolute like zero chance of success proposition. And the company had already kind of realized that like the product was scaling, like it was growing really slowly, and the costs to grow it were ballooning. You know what I mean? And so, and at the same time, WorkStep Retain was this like tripling year over year, like total rocket ship, incredibly happy customers, uh, like perfect retention record. And so basically, I kind of, like I said earlier, I like to create growth through reduction. This is a very extreme example where my recommendation to the company, uh, luckily to the very sympathetic ears of the founders, was that we should actually just like move all of our attention, all of our resources to WorkStep Retain, because there's really limited upside to WorkStep Hire. Even though it's a really like healthy business, it's not a hyper growth business. And at the same time, we're sitting on this powder keg of WorkStep Retain. And so we did a really painful pivot, which I still think is like the fact that the founders at WorkStep were able to like adopt that strategy and lead through it is one of the most impressive founder transitions I've seen. We basically put WorkStep higher, like we didn't kill it. There's no sense in killing it. It was such a healthy business, but we basically just staffed a couple of people on it to run it, eliminated all growth investments, and made it a really healthy, viable, profitable business on its own, while putting all of our eggs in the basket of like blowing up WorkStep Retain. And we, for the next couple of years, we 5x or even more that business because of just the leading indicator of how crazy valuable it is. And that to me is like real like growth stage strategy in a nutshell. Is like you could have just kept going with both products. You could have just kept adding products and thinking that's the way you add ARR. But this kind of almost slow down to speed up is oftentimes the best way to kind of really accelerate in the kind of early scale up stage.
That's a very interesting story. What I'm curious to know, before when the decision was made to just put all the resources and retain, and that period of time, how did you prioritize product development between hire and retain, especially when the resources were limited? Or could you actually like prioritize this development? Or like one was kind of shadowing the other one. That's why the decision was made.
Yeah, I mean, it was the problematics of what you just described was one of the kind of key evidence points of like why it made sense to galvanize the team. Because yeah, we had done like the basics of, we had split into two different pods where like one pod focused on one product and one pod would focus on the other. And so like kind of from an R&D perspective, resources were already kind of 50-50. Which you could always ask the question of like, okay, the revenue split was 90-10. So the resource spend was already kind of lopsided. But then when you start looking at things like how many bugs and unplanned work is which generating, and kind of how are these pods actually performing, and then you start looking at like what's kind of the hit rate of the experiments or kind of the hypotheses, and you start looking at like every single thing we had done on hire was like a negligible outcome. Like basically we had this long list of these swings of like, okay, this is going to change the math, either the efficiency of acquiring candidates, or the virality of candidate to candidate referrals, or the efficiency of actually like taking a candidate through, or like any metric. And almost all of our R&D efforts bore almost no fruit. So it's like, this is clearly wasteful spend. These experiments need to start hitting, or else it just means we're like trying to validate an invalid hypothesis. And so at first it was more like before, because obviously the strategic pivot took a really long time to take hold, because nobody makes a like a pivot of that magnitude overnight. So at first it was more like we just kind of started putting, let's say, like more attention and maybe like staffing the retain pod a little stronger. And we start marketing moved almost entirely already to retain, and we start kind of moving the company's public image, like the website and whatnot, be a lot more retention focused, to implicitly mean that like the employee listening part was more important. But the whole like real focus on the one product didn't unlock until we were willing as a company to say, look, we're a one product company with another product kind of on the side that's in true maintenance mode. But yeah, until you can make that very clear firewalling and distinction, you're just going to be peanut buttering your organization, which, at least to me, is usually like the worst drain of resources, is when you don't make a decision. Your decision is no decision. It's just like, everybody try covering all the ground. So that's usually what ends up happening.
And how was the team structure again before the decision? Was it like everyone was just trying to do focus on both of the products, or how like you had 10 engineer, five of them were focusing on retain, five of them were focusing on the hire?
Yeah, so it was two pods. So I can't remember the exact head counts, but it was to the tune of 10 engineers and like one product manager each pod, one designer each pod. So it's basically like these pods of about 7 or 8 individuals who had the sole mandate of like, you guys are the hire pod, y'all are the retain pod. That's all you're thinking of. And so the prioritization was literally just like, you have 2 swim lanes, and whatever fits in the higher swim lane, that's the higher capacity. Whatever fits in the retained swim lane, that's the retained capacity. So it's almost like the prioritization isn't stack ranked, which is, I mean, that's always one way of doing it, is you have like multiple pods, but they're all kind of generalist pods, and then you have a stack ranked set of priorities. But the funny thing about that is that it always ends up then creating this like single product strategy anyways. Like, I had a much more extreme example of this at Shutterstock, where back when I was there, the company had pretty aggressively went from image licensing only to adding video and music and editorial images and editorial video, and then lastly an API business line. But a lot of the company was horizontally geared. A lot of the kind of infrastructural, whether it's the subscription service, the media service, the search service, were all horizontalized, meaning serving all of these business units. And so whenever it came down for those horizontal teams to prioritize, they had to stack rank. And of course, I was responsible for music, video, and API, which were the second, third, and fifth largest business units, which means mine wasn't the biggest, which meant in the stack rank, my stuff was always down behind a long list of things, because end of day, even if my business units were driving more growth, the images business unit was commanding like well over 50%, if not like 70% of revenue. So when push comes to shove, especially at a publicly traded company, all of those company shared resources are just going to follow the biggest thing. And kind of, if we had done that at WorkStep, where like we just have these general pods that aren't aligned to a product, whatever we say, whatever we like, whatever slide where I present of like, look at this strategic framework here, they would have every day made choices that followed the money, and very likely would have followed it to build on higher.
That's very interesting. And you mentioned that retain displayed strong early indicators of growth. So what specific metrics or signals kind of convince you that retain had the potential to become the core product?
I mean, early on, a lot of it is very qualitative and instinctive, but also like retain had been out there for like the incubation, like the start 0 day for retain is a little fuzzy, because it started out more as like, hey, well, why don't you guys just experiment using this for your entire population? But basically at that point, nobody had ever churned from retain. It was like perfect churn record, which in like B2B SaaS, like that is something to pay attention to. And the way companies embrace the value proposition of continuous listening correlated to business outcome metrics was clear that there's like a huge untapped uh, opportunity there, because the traditional tool, like all the companies were struggling with the problem of, we need to retain our workforce, we just don't know how. And we had a solution, a slightly immature but fast maturing solution, that scratched that exact itch a lot better than the competition. And so you put kind of these two together, like the incredibly strong customer satisfaction and then perfect churn record or perfect retention record, with like the qualitative feedback we're getting from both researching the market and looking at what customers are telling us. It's just like, there's something really big here, and it's like a true B2B SaaS play. So why not charge full speed, full steam ahead? And luckily, we had a very smart, very intelligent board that was also like, "Yep, that's exactly right. You should do that." And that was like validation of like, if these industry veterans on the board are saying this is incredibly strong, it probably means something.
Yeah, it's very fascinating that the C level they decided to focus on retain while that meant a major cut in the revenue.
But I mean, in a way it did, in a way it didn't. I like to tell the story as like, I took the revenue from 10 million to 1 million, because that's a polarizing, controversial statement that makes people's eyebrows go up. But if you look at like the accounting, it went nowhere, right? Like the higher revenue stayed in the books. But it's just like, of course, we analyze the business through the lens of retained revenue, because from a revenue perspective, we didn't lose anything. But from a if you think of it as like, okay, you've got this 10 million thing, this 1 million thing, this 1 million thing is growing really fast. But if you sum those together, you go from like 11 million to 12 million to 13 million. It's like a really sad growth rate. But you isolate the retained component, you're going from 1 million to 2 million to 3, 4, 5. Like that's explosive growth. So it's all like perspectives, you know what I mean? Like what does the actual accounting say is one thing, but what does the analysis on the business and its growth aspirations and growth potential look like? Of course, we started looking at the business as like a $1 million business, because that's what the thing we're focusing on was. And I don't know exactly what the future for WorkStep is, and nor is it my place to comment on it, but I don't think it would be a crazy thing for them to spin out Hire as a separate company. You know what I mean? And but at the same time, like looking at it through the fundamentals, Hire went from being this like growth drag to a freaking healthy ATM that funded in like harsh economic times, funded the core business and its growth. And so again, like the numbers part of it, it's just whichever lens you want to look at it through. Um, which that's just accounting. It's full of lies. They call it assumptions. The accountants would call it assumptions, but anyway, there's you'd think that numbers are very impartial, but if you that's one of the fun things as an engineer I had to really work through in terms of working with FP&A, working with like analysis, is there's a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of variables that don't really have like strong research based backing, and that's okay. You're not trying to find the exact truth, you're trying to analyze a situation, and like a certain level of assumptions is really healthy. And a lot of engineering background product leaders often kind of crash into the, if I can't say for certain, I can't talk about it. You know what I mean? Like I can't project the thing because I don't know exactly what's going to happen. Well, assumptions are your friend. That's okay. You can model things.
Yeah, you're right. Looking back on the hire and retain journey, what key learnings would you like to share with product leaders managing multiple products at different stage of growth? And were there any signal or decision you feel you missed, or would you have approached differently in the early stages?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was kind of halfway through my WorkStep journey, I was kicking myself is I actually think I should have been more aggressive with pushing for the hire and retain split, and like more aggressively sided for like taking a stance at a thing I kind of instinctively early on knew was going to drive the biggest enterprise value growth. I think the learning here is that as a product person, you need to understand how not just to create business value. That's like one thing is I know how to like, create X dollars in sales or X dollars in savings or whatever. None of that matters unless you understand how that business value converts to enterprise or shareholder value. So again, in this case, if you just looked at it through the lens of like the P&L, it probably would have sounded like an absolute insanity to even like think of moving away from hire. But looking at it through the lens of like, okay, we're a venture backed company. Our job is to create a hyper growth company that like at least doubles year over year without burning through a huge mountain of capital. And you start looking at like the leading indicators of growth for hire, and you're like, this is not a hyper growth business. This is a very healthy, strong business, but not a hyper growth business. And then you look at retain and you're like, this is a hyper growth business. So I would never have sided with like kind of side tracking or back burnering hire if I didn't think through like the lens of like, what is this company as a business entity trying to achieve, and kind of what is the best way there? Because I mean, I was lucky to be in like the the C-level title in the executive team where I could have these conversations with the executive team, with the board. Sometimes as a product leader, you might be like not in the leadership team. You might be like head of product, but then there's like the founders and whatever are like the actual executive team. So you're stuck kind of looking at it from the outside. And I can promise you that the executive team and the board are having conversations like that. But then when they come out of those board meetings and leadership team meetings and they come to you and they say, like, don't focus on that, focus on this. If it doesn't align with your worldview, you might find yourself in this, like, oh, the executives are idiots and they're trying to push me in a direction I don't like. That only happens when you don't understand the kind of rules of what happens behind those closed doors in those board meetings. Like, it kind of, why did the people who wrote you checks at Series A or Series B, what was the hypothesis by which they wrote those checks? How long do they want to hold this asset? Do they want to exit in a couple of years, or is this like an IPO or a bust business? As a product leader, finding like whatever way you can, you don't necessarily have a way to get to the executive team necessarily, but you have to be able to have those conversations on the level of the executive so that you can truly get to the bottom of what is this business trying to achieve and what is like the executive team's perspective on how to get there. Because then, you know, if you are stuck managing multiple products and you have your own hunches on how to prioritize between them and like what to sidetrack and what to focus on, if that's not aligned with the way the board looks at it, the way the investors look at it, the way the executive team look at it, you're in for a rough ride.
Absolutely. No, I really like your points. There is a topic, very hot topic in LinkedIn, which everyone is talking about. I also saw that you wrote an article about it in, I think, your third post. So I was reading your blog post about working with founder mode. Now, Paul Graham and Brian Chesky lit the internet on fire with the founder mode post. I'm just curious, what do you think founder mode is, and how does it differ from manager mode?
Yeah, I mean, like everybody else on the internet, I have some opinions. Uh, it's I was biased towards hating the post as I opened it. I'm not a biggest fan of Paul Graham. Like, he's a controversial person, and whenever somebody's an edge lord like him, sometimes they hit, sometimes they miss. But I was getting ready to like, really like dig my heels in and really hate the post. But as I read it, I was like, ugh, I hate how much I don't hate this. It's the only thing that I fundamentally disagree is the connection between the mode and the founder. There's this cult of personality and this like survivor bias riddled love with narrative in Silicon Valley, which is like, oh my God, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, whoever the hell, like these people, like do exactly as these people did, or you're toast. I think that's BS. I don't think founders necessarily are the best people to go through every stage, even though we have the Zuckerbergs and the Daniel X who've done a remarkable job at being strong early stage founders and then built themselves to be great late stage operators through a combination of like scaling themselves and then hiring really strong leaders around them. Uh, but so my point is that the main takeaway product people should take from that post is that a really big company killer is this manager mode, which is like this bias towards like low risk appetite, a desire to analyze over act, just like slow everything down to a grinding halt, and like a lack of urgency and a lack of desire to give a license for a leader to kind of come to the ground and like look at the details of things. So like somebody recently gave, in my opinion, the best description of manager mode or leadership, founder mode, which was a license for the founder or leader to ask detailed questions about every aspect of the business. Because we have in especially in product, I think we should as product people we should be looking in the mirror with this. Is we have a tendency to add inertia where inertia is not necessary. We have a tendency to be like, hey, let's like de-risk all of these investments so we can go from like 60% confidence to 80% confidence. But if that 20 percentage point confidence increase costs us like 4 weeks of fuddy-duddying, it's probably better to take the swing right now at 60%, if that means you can take another swing later on. Um, the other part is this like deep allergy to micromanagement, hippo, highest paid person's opinion, executive swoop and poops, and this almost like weaponizing of the word trust. Like if somebody who's not the customer disagrees with something like a belief you hold as a product person, product people too often go into this mode of like, they don't trust me. Like I've witnessed so many times, and sometimes being in the seat myself, when a CEO or a CRO or somebody comes to me and says like, Tommy, your priorities are out of whack. Like you should, why are you wasting time on this thing? Like, and why aren't you just doing this other thing? And my immediate reaction and the reaction of many of my peers in product is like, oh, the CEO doesn't trust me. They're like, why are they auditing these decisions? Like they shouldn't be in the backlog. When my reaction should be, oh my gosh, I've missed something. Like this is information. Just like the fact that I've launched something and nobody cared about it, I don't like it, but that's information. Just like when a customer on a research call was just like in completely invalidate my things. I might hate it, but that is necessary information. Why is it so hard to treat founder input or CEO input or executive input as an important information source? Because, and another thing that kind of Chesky and Graham highlighted, founders often have superior market visibility. Like they've lived and breathed this product in this market for years longer than anybody who works for them, most people. Uh, they they've grown and like they've been able to get to where they are because they have superior instinct, and they also probably work a lot harder than anybody else in the organization. So I find it really appalling in hindsight how much I and my functional peers treat like executive participation in decision making as a bug rather than a real blessing almost.
It's very interesting how you see this, and I also really like the fact that how you're taking the points that we as a product people should see it and think about it. Maybe a follow-up question on that. So when do you think founders should start stepping back from the day-to-day operations?
That's a really good question. I don't think there's like a fundamentally correct answer. Like there are certain founders who should actually sell their company once they reach a point where it's just like not interesting or exciting for them anymore. There's some founders like take a Daniel Ek, like heck, I'm super happy he's still running Spotify. He's really good at it. Um, then there's the like, okay, should you like make your scope shallower or more narrow? Like there's a lot of founders who I literally just watched a presentation by, oh my God, I should remember his name, but the founder of Oscar Health, who after a really long and for all intents and purposes successful founder CEO journey, recently hired a professional CEO that had run Aetna, one of the biggest companies that his company is disrupting, as CEO, and he stepped down as to CTO. Like he demoted himself from CEO to CTO because he was a builder at heart. He loved building. He was still super into the company. He just knew that somebody was better at the most meaningful part of his job, and so he just pivoted himself to a job that fit his nature better. And actually, I really love that format of founder evolution, is when the founder goes through like 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever years of just like incredible, like all encompassing hustle and grind to get the company to like product market fit or thereabouts. Um, and then as soon as they start like identifying that their ability to scale as a person starts running out, then they bring in people to help that. But I actually like, I haven't embraced this enough in my past, but I'm for damn sure going to embrace it more from here on out. Those founders should still keep their like tentacles in a lot of the operational decisions. The nature just has to change a little bit from like omnipotent CEO to more like targeted advisor that, you know, the product team can leverage as like a really seasoned advisor on certain aspects of the market. Or some CEOs, like honestly one of my favorite CEOs I've worked with, Ankur Nagpal from Teachable, who was probably the most advanced growth hacker I've ever witnessed. Like this dude was a growth hacker, like kind of volume marketer like you've never seen. Him stepping down from the kind of CEO seat allowed him to like plug into kind of the marketing and like growth product work um, in a really impactful way. I just don't think me personally or the rest of the leadership team were skilled enough at the time to like really plug him in a healthy way. But like watching somebody like him who's like decent at everything but incredibly strong at some things be able to focus on those things that he's incredibly strong at, and the things that he actually gets pleasure out of. Because some founders, like for example Ankur, just didn't get a ton of pleasure from like sitting through a ton of financial spreadsheet presentations or, you know, all that fun stuff. So yeah, I don't think there's a real answer to your question of like when should a founder step down or kind of step aside. It's all of like how is, I think, the right question.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're slowly getting close to the end of the episode. I'm just curious, is there anything you would like to share you've been working on? Anything you want the listeners to check out?
Yeah, I mean, I'm writing this. You've alluded to my newsletter a couple times. I'm doing a really weird thing where like I'm not publicly, like the link to the newsletter subscription is not public anywhere. I'm gonna keep it that way. I don't intend to become the next Lenny Rachinsky or whoever. Uh, but if anybody who's listening who's curious, like feel free to look me up on Twitter or LinkedIn and send me a DM. Uh, if you're not a complete weirdo, I will add you to the newsletter. I'm doing it more as like a clearing my head, a retrospective, if you will, as I'm trying to answer what's next. Um, but people have found it incredibly valuable because the reason I'm keeping it secret is that I can be a little more candid, a little more tactile. Because if you go on Medium and find all my old blog posts, they're like embarrassingly abstract. They're very like, usually you should do this, and I've seen that this might happen. It's like, for reading them in hindsight, it's not particularly valuable to read these like abstract musings. And so I'm trying to use kind of the very poor shroud of secrecy of my newsletter as a way to get a little more like in the weeds of what has actually happened, what was my learning from it. So find me on the socials and hit me up, and I'll hook you up.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tommy Forsstrom.
I appreciate it. Thank you.